Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and welcome to this video. This video is going to be Python in 30 minutes. So the goal of this video is to give you a introduction to Python, which is a programming language. Okay, and Python is what's called a higher level language. What does that mean? There's certain languages that are higher level and certain languages that are lower level. Generally just means just how complicated does it get. Okay, so things like C++, Rust, these are lower level languages, meaning you're programming at a lower level in the hardware. You're basically telling the machine what to do directly, almost, not quite. So that means you have to give it a lot more direction. So there's a lot more code you have to write. There's a lot more sort of complex concepts you have to know. And that's good for things that need like super fast software. Okay, but most things nowadays, like just writing a little script to go convert some files for yourself, or a basic web server, most applications nowadays don't necessarily need every ounce of speed. Computers are pretty fast nowadays. So nowadays, higher level programming languages, which means a lot of the complexities of the lower languages have been abstracted away, meaning they've made simpler versions of them so you don't have to deal with the complexities, are more popular. So this is like Python, JavaScript, Ruby. These are all higher level languages. The way you program them is quite a bit easier. You're not dealing with things like typing generally. You're not dealing with memory management. So they're generally a good place to start learning programming and solidify those early programming concepts without having to get too down in the weeds with things again like typing and memory management, which are important things and good things to learn down the road, but great to have those out of the way when you start learning programming. So again, probably the best languages to start with are going to be your Python, JavaScript, and Ruby. Any of those are a great choice. Okay, and again, whatever programming language you're learning, you can always find videos at my website, devnursery.com, on pretty much everything. Okay, so again, tutorials on like everything. Okay, so now that we've established sort of this, what's the reason to learn Python, you can build whatever you want. You can build web applications with Python. You can build mobile applications with Python. You can do data science applications with Python. You can just build helpful scripts and automations with Python. Same thing can be said for JavaScript and Ruby. So generally, like any of these general purpose programming languages can do all these things. But Python is very popular. It has a huge community, which is why it has so much momentum. It's such a good thing to learn right now. But with that, I'm on this website called replit.com. Okay, replit.com. This is a great place to start learning a language because you don't have to worry about installing software and doing all this stuff. You can just program, write code in here in your browser, get comfortable doing that, and then worry about like learning how to like download the software and all that stuff at a later point. So set up an account here at replit.com, and what you'll do is you'll click on the plus sign. And again, if you like how I'm in dark mode, okay, that would be, you can change that in your settings. Okay, so you would just go to your account settings and change that. Okay, but I'm going to click New REPL, and I'm going to click on Python REPL, and you see REPL has possible REPLs for all sorts of different programming languages. Okay, this is a very fun playground for me where I can go try out all sorts of different things. But what we care about right now is Python. So I'm going to create a Python REPL. Okay, we'll call it my first Python REPL, and we'll open it up. Cool. Okay, now Python is what's called a interpreted language. Okay, so Python files are not compiled, even though you'll hear some people say that. And the difference is when a file is interpreted, the software, in this case Python, the Python engine, reads the file and then runs the code right away. So the thing happens right away. In lower level languages, they're typically compiled, which means the code is read and creates another file, like an executable, and then I have to go run that file separately. So basically the turning the code into something the computer understands and the running of the code are simply two separate points in time when you compile. When you interpret, it's done at the same time. So with Python, you don't have to worry about like, you can run the file and then the file will run right away because it's interpreted on the fly. Okay, so for example, the first thing you always want to learn in any programming language And again, notice how this REPL creates a file called main.py. Okay, by default, if I click run, what it'll do, it'll run whatever code is in this main.py file, and its output will show up under this console, which technically is open to the Python REPL. Okay, what's a REPL? A REPL stands for read, evaluate, print, loop. Okay, so technically here in the Python REPL, I could actually type in Python commands. I could do like 5 plus 5, and it's going to give me back 10. Okay, so I can actually just type in Python code there line by line and have it evaluated. It reads it, it evaluates it, it prints it, and then asks and loops and does it again. But we can also run our Python files in there. But the way this is set up in REPL, run will always just run the main.py. If I want to run a different file, okay, let me just actually first just do a quick script. So print is a function, okay? And you always know when something's a function, it's because for me to use it, I have to put parentheses after its name. Think of like print as sort of a magical spell you have. But for you to cast it, I have to put parentheses. So print is the magical spell, and the parentheses are the thing that allows me to cast the spell. That's what functions are. They're just little things that I can do whenever I want. And sometimes I can give these magical spells like some extra information so they can do something special for me. So print, what it does, and these special bits of information are called arguments. So this print function takes an argument, and whatever I put in that parentheses is what print will then print to the console, print over here. Okay, this is always very, very important in any programming language, whatever function does this, because code, the machine doesn't know that you can't see what's going on in the machine. So for us to know that our program is doing what we think it's doing, we generally are going to want to print things to the terminal so we can see it with our human eyes. So I'm going to say print the words hello world. Okay, and notice how I put quotation marks around this. Okay, so this is a string. Okay, anytime you see quotation marks around something, it's a string. Okay, so what I'm saying is I'm telling print to print hello world. So now if I run it, and watch what happens, hello world gets printed to the console. Cool, simple enough, right? Okay, now what if I created another file? So I'll say I'll create cheese.py. And in here I'll do print goodbye world. Okay, I could do that. Problem is if I hit run, again, run's going to run main.py, not cheese.py. So in that case, I'm not seeing the goodbye world here. So that's why we have this other tab called shell. So while console is technically the Python REPL, so that's me interacting with Python directly, shell is technically giving us an instance of the bash shell. The bash shell is technically, if you use Linux machines like I do, if you use a Mac OS, bash is sort of the default command line. If you're on Windows, then it's PowerShell, not quite the same thing. Although you can download software called Git Bash that allows you to use bash on Windows. Or you can do Windows subsystem for Linux and install sort of a Linux command line on your computer. Highly recommend doing that. But for now, you don't need to worry about that. Just know that you have access to an instance of this bash shell. It's just a place where you can send commands to the computer under this shell tab. And it automatically is inside this folder. So see, this folder is this folder right here. Like if I do this command ls, it lists all the files. And see, there's my 2 files. So what I can do is I can use the Python command to run those files. So I can be like python cheese.py. And basically this is the command, and I'm telling the Python to run this file. And then it'll then run the file, and any output shows up in the terminal like that. So see, now I see the goodbye world. So these are the 2 ways you can run files here on REPL. I can either click this run button, but that's always going to run this main.py. If for some reason I want to run some other file, then my best bet is going to be using this shell tab. And again, this is technically bash. So if you want to learn like all the shell commands and ways you can use shell, bash is what you would look up and learning more about bash, which is really worth learning about. But I'm not going to get too deep right now. Main thing is, if I need to write a Python file, I type on Python, then the file name, that's under the shell tab. under console, this is the Python REPL. And if I just hit run, it's going to run the main.py. That's the main takeaway. How do I run my files? That's the point. Okay, so far we know that the print function, this command right here, will show me a string. It'll print literally print anything I give it, okay? And you can give it multiple arguments, so I can give it multiple things. I just put a comma between each one, so I can say print hello world and print cheese. And watch what it does. It prints all of it. I can just keep doing comma and then giving it something else. Then maybe I give it a number. And notice, a number, I don't use quotation marks because a number is a mathematical value. So 1 is a number. Okay, and then I can say true. Notice I don't put quotation marks around true because true is not a string. It doesn't mean words. True actually represents the actual value of true, like versus true versus false. So these are your main data types in Python. But I can pass them all to print, and print will print them out. So you see there, hello world cheese 1 true. Okay, so those are all data types in Python. Okay, strings. Technically, this is not a number, it's what's called a integer. And integers are always whole numbers. And then there's floats, which are numbers with decimals. Okay, so technically these are strings because they have quotation marks. We have, oh, there's 2 commas there now. Okay, there's an integer, which are whole numbers, floats, which are numbers with decimals, and booleans, which are true. There's just 2 booleans, true and false, and they're uppercase in Python. So if you've used pretty much any other programming language, typically lowercase, but in Python they are uppercased. So keep that in mind. Okay. Now, any of these types of data, I mean, the goal of the language isn't to just print data to the screen. That's kind of boring. We do like fun stuff, okay? But sometimes you need to save the data so you can refer to it multiple times. So what we can do is we can store data in a variable. So to create a variable, we just create like a name for the variable. So literally anything you type that doesn't have quotation marks is going to be treated as a variable. So in this case, we'll say my variable. Okay, so this is called my variable. And I can store something inside of it. Okay, so I will say equals, and equals doesn't mean equality. What it means is store inside of here. Okay, so I'm saying inside my variable, let's store whatever's after the equal sign. So I can store the number 1. Okay, again, I can store any data type in a variable. So let's try let's do my variable 2, and now we'll put in a string, hello world. And we'll do another variable, my variable 3, and we'll store false. Okay, the boolean. And now that's inside those variables. How do I know, how can I confirm that that data is in that variable? Well, we can use print. Instead of saying print and then giving it a direct value, I can just give it a variable. So we'll say my variable 2, my variable 3. Okay, and what it's going to do is just log whatever is stored inside that variable. Okay, so if I hit run, so you see 1, hello world, false. Those are the things stored in these variables. Okay, so I can take any type of data, store it in a variable. But notice, variable names are just names. So you see, whenever whenever Python sees like a name, it treats it as a variable. Whenever it sees words wrapped in quotation marks, it's going to treat it as a string. Okay, so if I accidentally put quotation marks around my variable 2, it's not going to know I'm trying to refer to the variable. It's thinking that I want to pass it the string, my variable 2, and watch what happens. See, now hello world is gone because it doesn't know I'm trying to refer to the variable. Instead, it's just printing that string. Okay, so always be careful. Like, am I saying use the thing in the variable, or am I saying this is the thing I want you to print, meaning I want it to be a string? Okay, so, and actually let me make this bigger. There we go. Okay, that should make it a little bit easier to read. Okay, and cool. So now we know about variables. we know our data types, we know how to print things to the screen. That's always the first thing you want to learn whenever learning any programming language. But the next category of things you want to learn are conditionals and loops. That's the next step. Okay? So for example, what you do in Python, we write the word if. This means like, if something is true, I want to run some code. And then here in the parentheses, you would express some sort of question like, does 5 equal 6? And see, notice I put 2 equal signs. 2 equal signs doesn't mean store like variables where I said store this in this variable. 2 equal signs means, are these two things the same thing? Okay, equality. Is 5 and 6 the same thing? No, but that's the point. So essentially what I'm saying is that if this is true, then run the code that's below it. Now notice that I'm going to write the code, and when I write the code, it's tabbed. So notice this tab here. It could be 2 spaces, 4 spaces, a tab, whatever. Okay, people will debate what they think is the proper way of indenting in Python. It just needs to be indented, and all the lines need to line up. That's so we can see like this is the main line, and then we tab it over to know that this line of code belongs to the if statement. That's what matters. So Python knows that this is the code that belongs to the if because of this space. Okay, that's why it understands that. So it knows that if this is true, and again, you have to put that colon at the end of the line, it expects that. It knows that anything that's tabbed under it is part of what you run when it's true. Then when we want to say, hey, we're no longer talking about the if, we go back to sort of the main indentation. So I'll say else. And what else does is basically saying, if the previous if statement is not true, what should you do? In this case, we're just going to print false. And again, this is just an example. So this 5 equals 6 should print false, right? Because 5 and 6 are not the same thing. And that's what I get, false. Notice that this line of code never ran because this is not true. Now if I change this and make this 5 equals 5, okay, then I get true because this is true. This line of code runs. So you can create like conditional code. Okay, now let's have some fun with this. Code always gets more interesting once the user starts interacting with your code. So let's do this. There's a function called input. Okay, and what input does is it's going to ask the user for some input. So what we can do is we can pass it an argument of like the question you want to ask, like give me a number. Okay, it's just going to print that text before it asks for input. But we need to save the input. We need to save the result, the return value of this function. Because functions can sometimes give you something back. So notice it's a function because there's a name and parentheses. So just kind of like print was a name, and then we use parentheses to say we are casting the spell. Input is a function, and we're saying, hey, we want to use the function, so we're using parentheses. And in the parentheses, we can give it some arguments, some information to use. Okay? But the functions can sometimes also return a value. They can give us something back that we can use. This function returns whatever the user types in. And I can now save that in a variable. So I can just say, I make a variable called user input equals the result of input, give me a number. So whatever the user types in ends up getting saved in this variable. Okay, and then what we can do is we can take that input and convert it into a number, because input's always going to give you back a string. So even if they type 1, it's going to technically be 1 with quotation marks, because input doesn't know the user's intention. It doesn't know like, oh, you meant to type in the number 1. So it's just going to give it to you as a string. So we need to convert that to a number so we can evaluate it. So the easy way Python allows you to do what's called typecasting, where you can change one data of one type to another type. And it's pretty straightforward. There's a function that matches the name of every data type. So in this case, we want to take that number that's a string and turn it to an actual real number, specifically an integer, okay, because right now we're dealing with whole numbers. So I would just type in int, that's the function name. So int, see, that's the name of the function, and then there's parentheses after it. And then I can tell it, well, what do I want you to do this function? I want you to take the user input and turn it into an integer. So this function returns whatever I gave it, the user input, but as a integer, as a number. Okay, so again, just to give some comments, and it's always good to write comments in your code, so that way you know what the code does. You just put a hash. So in this case, we're getting input from the user. Okay, and then here, we're converting the input into an integer. Okay, so now num is going to be sort of the number version, assuming the user typed in a number, which they better. Okay, so now I'll ask the question: is num, that this variable, whatever's inside this variable, is it greater than 5? Okay, so we can use like normal, like greater than, equal than symbols in asking our questions. So now I can run the code and see it's going to ask me for a number. I'll give it a number of 3. And I get false, because false is not greater than 5. Now if I run the code again, okay, I type in the number 3. Okay, I can write, well, I already did the number 3, so let's do number 6. And I hit run. I put in the number 6 and I hit enter. I get true, because 6 is greater than 5. So I'm able to control what happens in my code by asking questions. This is why ifs are super important, because oftentimes you're, responding, user gives you input, and you want to be like, okay, well, if they enter this, do this. If they enter that, do that. Did they push this button? If they push this button, they should do that. So if statements are how you say, if this is the thing, then do that thing. Okay? But sometimes you need to repeat it. Maybe I want to ask you, I want to do this whole thing like 3 or 4 times. Okay, what I can do is I can wrap this in a loop. So generally what we're going to do is create a loop. Okay, and a loop just means repeat code until something is no longer true. Okay, first we need to create a counter. Okay, and typically what you'll do is you'll start the counter at 0. And then the word while is what says like this is a loop. So we're going to say while, okay, while counter is less than 3, because I only want to loop 3 times. Do this. And again, just like the if statement, it gets a colon at the end. And then I'm going to tab the code under it. So what I really want to do is repeat all this 3 times. So I'm going to actually take all this code and put it right under it. But notice now I need to make sure it's tabbed. So for this code to belong to that while loop, I need to make sure that this is all tabbed. So it's all got to be tabbed to be one tab under the while. So the if statement, all this has got to get tabbed over 1, because again, this needs another tab because it's got to belong to the if. And then actually this 2 lines I don't need. And then I can get rid of all this up the top. Okay, so you see now what we're doing is all of the code is wrapped in this loop. But here's the thing. I got to make sure that I always make the counter go up 1. Because if not, the counter will always be 0. And counter will always be less than 3. And I'll get an infinite loop. So at the end of the code, I have to go back out of this else. Go right here. Make sure it lines up with the while code. So Python's all about lining up your code. So say this lines up with the while. Okay. What I want to do is say counter equals counter plus 1. So what that means, whatever counter is now, add 1 to it and make that the new value of counter. So first time, counter is 0. So counter 0 plus 1 is 1, and now 1 counter is 1. Then in the next loop, counter is 1, so 1 plus 1 is 2, and that becomes counter, and so forth. So now this should only loop 3 times, because come the third loop, counters is now going to be 3, and 3 is not less than 3. So I hit run, and then we do, I'll say, again, now it's going to ask me for all this, so I say 6, but see, it's now going to ask me again, 2, 7. So you see, we repeated this now 3 times. Okay, because that's what a loop does. It repeats the code until the thing is no longer true. Okay, that works. But the problem is they have to be consecutive. What if I want to do this, but I want to do something like in between? So I want to loop 3 times, do something else, then loop 3 times again. A good way to handle that is with a function. A function allows you to wrap some code in your own custom function. In the same way you could use print as many times as you want, or you could use input as many times as you want, you can create your own custom functions. So that way you can call a sort of like subroutine whenever you need it. So to do that, all we have to do is we're going to we write the word def, which means define. I'm defining a function, and we'll just call it, loop in input. Okay, that's what we'll call it, because technically we're looping and asking for input. Okay, and then we put a parentheses that represents like this parentheses, like that we would use when the function. We get to define the kind of things that we can give to the function. We get to create variables. We'll come back to that. Okay, for now we'll just keep it empty. Okay, and now I can put this code inside the function. Now again, it's got to be tabbed. So what I'm going to do is get rid of these spaces, and I got to tab everything so that way it's inside the function. Because again, as soon as you see a colon, anytime you see a colon, the next line, for it to belong to that block of code, it's got to have a tab. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to tab everything. So tab, 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 tab. Oops, too many tabs on that line. Tabs, 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 tab, 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 tab. Okay, so you can see that this is the line of code that belongs to the function. This is the line of code of stuff that belongs to the while loop. This is the code of stuff that belongs to the if, and this is the code that belongs to the else. Okay, so it's all about those colons and making sure you keep track of the tabs after the colon, so you can see what code belongs to who. Okay, cool. So now what I can do is I can call this function just like I called print. So I just type in loop and input, give it a parentheses, and then I can do something else like print cheese, and then I can loop and input again, and there we go. Okay, so watch what's going to happen. It's going to ask me to do the question 3 times, then it's going to say cheese, and then it's going to ask me again 3 times. Okay, because it's doing this. This is just me defining. So this now is just me defining what does loop and input do. Okay, so whenever I use loop and input, it's going to do whatever I put in its code block here. So it's just repeating that code for me. So now if I run the code, okay, it's going to ask me for a number. So 3, 2, 5, and it says cheese, and then I give it another 3 numbers because I ran that code. Because see, that this code is just that looping 3 times and asking the question. So it does that, then it prints cheese, and then it does the 3 loops again. And that's the beauty of functions. I don't have to do them consecutively like a loop where the code runs 3 times back to back. The function I can repeat whenever I want it. I can just like call the function here. If I need it again later, I'll use it there. Notice like I've just been using print whenever I want. That's the beauty of functions. Okay. That is a pretty good starting place, getting you familiar with how to use Python here in the terminal. Again, you can learn more about Python by heading over to devnursery.com and looking up my Python playlist. Okay, and if you want to learn more about any of these other languages, there's that too. Okay, you got a lot of content on a lot of languages. There's no lack of things to learn. So I'll see you guys all there, but this has been Python in 30 minutes. Okay, again, the first goal you should have is to get really comfortable with while loops, if statements, and writing functions. That's job number 1. My recommendation is, once you kind of get okay with the syntax, head over to codewars.com and start doing some of the easier challenges. You click on kata here, click on level 8. Level 8's the easiest. Okay, and then look up Python. So I say, hey, I want Python challenges. And then look up these ones that are called grasshopper. Okay, the ones with the word grasshopper on them tend to be really easy. Perfect if you're new to this. And that'll just give you some practical challenges to kind of start digging your teeth as you learn the language. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy. See you all later.